Welcome to Wickerson Studios. My name is Michael Wickerson, and I just want to give credit over here to a wonderful person, Jose Luis. I met him indirectly through his Parametric Camp videos. This video series, the Introduction to Parametric Modeling, I just went to KCAI and taught it to a couple of students over a couple-hour period, and I wanted to show what I covered, not only for them, basically put this 10 series into a nutshell, and I'll show exactly how I did it. I did it by pre-sending pretty much every stage of that project all the way through in a file that I generated, and I'll have available on GitHub for those that want to do it. And what was covered in here, and I'll just do this very quickly in 10 parts. The first part is quite simple. Jose Luis describes Rhino, and you can download Rhino, get a partial well, we'll talk about it. Basically, Rhino is a 3D modeling environment for NURBS geometry, and Grasshopper is a parametric modeling plugin that can be paired against that and work within that. The second section that's covered in a nutshell is to use Windows over top of Mac. Not that it's totally necessary, but plugins are very good for Windows. And you can see I have a lot of extra plugins up at the top, and actually some that I've created myself and gotten into custom nodes and the GH Python and the C# nodes. That you can get the evaluation series for 90 days, and after that you just can't save files. So that was section 2, and I think I did it all in this one section. Number 3 was that he covers the super, in his word, basics of Rhino and how it works, and he shows how to customize and get ready in the Rhino window. Rhino, of course, is that 3D modeling environment, and you initially want to learn how to pan around, zoom in and out, and with a shift, slide things different ways. So navigate, pan, and zoom. Your viewports can be chosen by double-clicking up here and then getting rid of them or getting them down to 1. The properties is something that he covers off on the sides, and he says, listen, you might want to use this to know what you're dealing with. You can always type in the keyword what to get to those properties. He talks a little bit about layers. But he really focuses away from the icons maybe on the side here and says the command line is really an area that you can go up and start thinking about what you want to do within this section up at the top after file. But if you can type in a word, it basically will do that for you. He does suggest right off the bat going to tools and going down to options, and within this jumping into appearance, going into extending that into colors and changing your background color to white and making your major and minor grid lines a different color. That's exactly what I did. So it may look a little different than yours. And he says that looks much, much nicer. So he gets into basic geometry. So grab a point, pop it on. If you want to right-click on here, you can select multiple points and click as many as you want. And this is the beginning of working static modeling. He then goes on and says, well, let's do a polyline, pop that in like this. Then let's go in and do some freeform curves that may be control point oriented or directed, so you can see exactly what's happening here. And he's saying you can always modify by using the gumball tool down here, grab a selected curve point, bring it up, and start to make these a little less planar. So I move this whole polyline up and this one up. He does talk about using the vertices and the control points, which you can click on and off. If you go into here, you can click control points off and on, and then those control points can be the things that you're using to drive this geometry as well. He distinguishes between meshes and NURBS and does a great job at that, talking about control points, freeform, and then he decides, let's just go in here and make a control point curve. Let's make one of them. Let's repeat that with a right click and make another one. And let's make a third one with a right click. And then he says, let's take this one and move it up. And let's take this one and move it up. And now you can see by navigating what we have in these 3 lines, and he says you can go so far as to give them a little bit of a twist and use your gumball to turn them a little bit and rotate them. And he says let's go in and type in a loft command to get used to loft commands. And it says select your curves to loft 1, 2, 3, and take your we might want to line the curves, not that it really matters, and then hit done and hit OK. And then let's take that and go to shaded so you can see what kind of surface we made. You can see I made a pretty weird intersecting surface, but it's a fun way to build in static modeling. He then goes on to say, to compare this, what's actually happening in the NURBS environment is you can go in and type in the sphere, which will be a NURBS sphere, and you can see how that has a center and pulls out, and you're left with this very perfect form. And then he calls it discretize an object, which is what happens when you go in and use something like a mesh sphere. And a mesh sphere is going to do basically the same thing, but you're going to see that it's broken down into vertices and flat surfaces that can be triangle or quads to hold those forms. Okay, so that was section 1, 2, 3, and that's basically what we got through there. Then he says, let's jump into the grasshopper environment, but he still wants to talk a little bit about parametric modeling, the software to and for modeling in the Rhino environment. So he showed those 3 lofts, and the keys are that those curves that I just had in here, if we go back far to this, you'll see that you can grab one of these curves and move it, and it doesn't change the geometry of what's here. So your modeling workflows, they do not hold any relation to the curves. They do not adapt to the curves through curves that put control points or vertices, and they're independent and the link has been lost. So what he suggested is go into the grasshopper environment and start to build things so that the modeling workflows are flexible, adaptable, and change. They define a tree of relationship logic, and his vocabulary is just wonderful. So thank you, Jose Luis. And all of those changes broadcast down the tree you have generated. So once again, that really makes some sense to me when I'm thinking about this. Grasshoppers is a section that's going to give you a vanilla pattern of params, math, sets, vectors, and so on through displays. And you're going to be dealing with things called components and containers. They're all components. And you can create, so for example, he says, let's create something like a cylinder and see what happens within this window. And I don't know if he does it right then and there. I think he does it farther along. But right here, actually, that's what's happening here. There's the cylinder. So basically, we can go in, and I've turned my preview off. So I'm going to turn my preview off on, and you can see there's a point that's actually, if I zoom in really far, you'll see that this point actually follows these number sliders in an XYZ direction because that's how I've constructed a point. And if you're wondering how these names are coming up here, it's because I brought in this plugin called Bifocals Tool, which allows me to see inputs and number sliders, processing through, taking a look here at what's needed numbers and then giving you a point. And then he goes so far as to create a cylinder by preview on, and there it is that is dictated by that point. And you've also made a parametric number slider for the radius and the height and the default base. It's wonderful that this actual base reads a plane, which can actually take a point, meaning that. So what he suggests is go on in, make yourself some points, some panels, some sliders, make yourself a cylinder, and realize that you define the values. In doing so, you define the tree and the hierarchy and the output. The more and more you get into this, the more rich and complex it becomes, and the beauty and magic of parametric modeling reveals itself. So I'm just going to take this and put that to off. We're going to go on to the next stage, which I think was section 5, the fifth video. And I'm trying to do in 2 hours something in a matter of minutes. So let's look at Grasshopper. And he immediately says, let's jump over here, makes it a little bigger. And he says, what is going on here? We have a menus bar that does some wonderful things. And one little tricky thing here is there is some interesting components that he says, make sure you click on seeing your obscure components so you can see them all. He suggests dropping your ribbon bar down, which we'll talk about in a minute. The display, he says, go down here and find out how you want to display, and we'll talk about icons. If we take a look in at this number slider here, at this tool construct point, and we go to display and we click that, we can turn it to full words, or we can keep the display to icons. Fancy wires is something you want to keep on as well as display, and don't confuse this display with this display panel on the on the ribbon tool. It's different. In here you'll see things that go all the way down the canvas widgets and what you can turn on and turn off. So what he suggests is check out the ribbon tools, see what they are, leave them on icons, and start to customize your eyes to these. Keep in mind that the hexagon pattern here is a container that does less than what a component actually does. And then throughout that, you can just drag points. So you go into something like vectors, grab yourself a point and drag it, put it on your canvas, and sure enough, a point shows up on the canvas on the Rhino window. I like to call that a ghosted shape. And one thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to click here, kind of like we did in Rhino, and this is not in his videos, click the preference and say for an object that I'm actually putting my hand on, I want to make it nice and blue and rich, and for objects that I don't select, I want to put it up into an orange. And that will allow me, if you take a look here, let me just select this and say, actually I don't think you have to hit OK. You can see that when I select an object, it goes from orange to blue. And this one, if I actually wanted to turn the preview on, you'll see there's a second point there. So this point and this point, which is not is defaults to you can extract a parameter and you'll get the numbers that are there, but you'll need a panel to see what those actually are. So I'm not going to confuse that. But right now, this point's kind of obsolete. It's not needed, but that's how you drag things into the picture and into the frame. He gets down there and shows a bunch of tools and tricks to what to do. One thing I like to do is when you lose yourself in here and you want to center your whole thing, just click here and you'll see your whole script and what you're working on. And then you'll learn how to zoom in, you'll learn how to panel, you'll learn how to select, edit a group section and just move that. And you'll actually go so far, if I can actually remember, I think it's Alt, you can actually splice and make these things longer, and you can, I think you can only make them longer. You can actually shrink them unless you do undo. So you want to learn to navigate just as much in this as you did in the other one. And he says customize the UI as best you can, which is what he does. There is something nice that you can just, the inputs and outputs always read left to right. And he says hover over these things and you'll see, and I can't point to it, but you see that hexagon with the 0.1 is telling me it needs something that looks like that. So you go back over here and you click and you'll say, what is that? Hover on it. That contains a collection of floating point numbers, which means a number that has a decimal point, or and then so many, what do they say in the number sliders? If you want to change it, edit how many digits you want those decimals, and it's set to 2 there. All right, so you want to set up a link to change the course and have reactions to what you do. In the 6th video, he customizes Grasshopper and goes on in and spends some time comparing icon to text, the wire displays, the bifocals tool, just what I talked about. And he says double click on the canvas and type whatever you want. And if you don't know what something is, like say we put in point and it starts to come up and I've used it a lot, there it is. But if I don't know where that is on the canvas, I can hit Control Alt and then click that node and you'll see this weird red pops up. It shows me the ribbon tool and where exactly I'm selecting it. So if I went up to this 4-point surface and did the same, it would tell me that it's over there in surfaces under freeform. It's one of the first items. So that's a nice way to navigate yourself around. He says drag this down to 3 or 4 rows so you can actually see as many of these to get you playing with them. One thing you do to a component here, even though this one isn't running, it'll give you a chance to preview on or preview off. And since this one's mirroring, we preview it on or we can preview it off. And if you preview off, then it doesn't matter to enable. And you can totally disable like pulling the plug on things or not. One thing he says back up here in display is down to the widget tools is you can turn off that canvas widget, which was the compass, because he never uses it. It pops up down here and it follows around what you're doing. So I'm going to take his advice on that because I like the guy and he's taught me an awful lot. And the rest of the things he suggests leave up are the canvas widgets. Align allows you to line up and script very nice and neat. The Markov shows you this bottom panel down here of the most recent nodes you've used. The profiler goes in and actually shows you on bigger files. If the profiler's on, let me just jump in here and grab a grid, which he does an example of. You'll see, and actually I think my profiler is off, or at least I thought it was on. Displays, canvas widgets, profiler. I wonder why that's not telling me. Maybe I need something that takes a little longer. Well, that's weird that it's not actually coming up and showing me the amount of times it takes to process that. It usually is in milliseconds. And there it is. There's a 6 milliseconds for a sphere in the bottom. And that's the profiler going to work. And then the last one under the canvas widgets is message balloons, which you're definitely going to need because whenever something's not gray, you can click on the message balloons and learn what exactly is wrong with that file. And that gets a little more tricky when you get into GH Python nodes and C# nodes. On to group 7, which is exciting. I think he keeps going. And he says, listen, the architecture of the Grasshopper components. There's inputs. You hover over. You see what it wants. You right-click on it. It will tell you a whole bunch of wonderful things you can do with it, from baking that item into the Rhino window, all the way through doing some data tree analysis of flattening and grafting and simplification. You can get into your first scripting, which will move you towards programming with the expression node, which I'll let you explore. And you can certainly set containers of setting 1 point, setting multiple points, and you can extract parameters and do a bunch of wonderful things with this. And that extends to things like number sliders, which actually give you that chance, if I go in, to go beyond those types of edits and get into actually animating something within your window and making your first animation within your Rhino environment. They also show some very simply connection. So if you had something and you hit Control, you'd see this goes red with a minus, and that would disconnect it. And that's opposite just connecting it. And another thing you can do is Control Shift, pull something out and plug it in somewhere else. And if I do that right, that should be able to plug in and override the other one. And actually, it didn't override it. This one still has to be disconnected. A lot of times when you plug one in, it will override it. And if I plug that in, the other one disappears. But if I wanted this one to join, I would hit Shift, and I can plug in two at once. And another thing to do, we'll get into merge components to do that. But I'm going to reset this to where it was because that's where I liked it. So there's a little tool tips that he gets through: graph simplification, expressions, setting numbers, and etc. The number slider is quite a tool, and I think I actually spent a little time on it. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I did over here with the number slider. Possibly we'll get there and I'll talk about it again. What he goes through is the fact that you can enable, bake, do a bunch of wonderful things, but make yourself a bunch of stuff and pull in some things like under vectors, pull in a point and see what you need to make it run. Get into the habit of putting, if it needs a number at one side, a number slider at one side, and putting that in until it runs. And then get in the habit of using the most common node, which is a panel node, which is a string node, which will tell you, a text node, which will tell you what's there, and actually output that same data. So he shows kind of the futility, but the nonsense of doing this, but making panel go into panel, go into panel, go into panel. The one thing you can't do is do a loop back, and that's where you're going to break things in Grasshopper and really start to require iterations and recursion within programming Grasshopper and C#. I hope everybody's following me here. I'm on double speed today and having a blast. So what he suggests is go in, take a look at something as simple as over here in curve, circle. There's 7 different ways to make a circle. Keep in mind that Grasshopper is a subset of Rhino. So if I go into curves and I see that there's primitives and there's ways of making circles, there's 6 different ways. And he immediately goes here, and I was talking a little bit about these other things, and I'll leave it in this file. He says, get all these up and running. Well, how do you get these up and running? This one needs a center. It's going to require a point. It's going to require a normal, which is a vector, and it's going to require a radius, which is a number. And so to get this one up and running, you're going to want to input a point. And since we had one, I think I'll just default to this one, which is a point defaulted. I will make a vector, and the vector does not work until I plug something into it. So I will type in a shortcut of a :1, which will put that out in the X direction. And I'll pull that up into X, and I should have a normal. And I could actually take the radius of 1, and that should get my radius up and running. I believe preview on, and if anything's outputting and I'm not thinking too hard, sometimes I don't have to take my, there we go, we have one circle that's working in that radius, and there it is. So you get these things up and running in practice and go through until you can follow what is required and make that operational. Great example. Then he says go on, make yourself some curves, make yourself some objects, cones, spheres, cylinders, go so far into the transformations and planes and vectors, and there's a reason why they call Jose Luis Dr. Vector. All right. Number 8, so the 8th one, and I am flying here. I'm only, I don't know how many minutes I'm into this thing, but I'm too excited to stop. What I did start here was he goes in and he says, listen, there's unique components, and what they are things that are parametric parameter components. And he says the ones he's been using are sliders and panels. Here's an example of how to make some sliders. And you're like, well, what did you do there? Well, if I just take a slider and import it in here, it's going to default to 0.250, 3 decimal places, and it's going to be a slider between 0 and 1. If I type in, double click and hit the digit 1, it's going to be an integer that goes from 0 and 1, nothing in between. If I type in 1.00, I'm going to get a slider from 0 to 1, but with 2 decimal places. And you can do the same for some practice with some numbers like 2, which will think you want everything integers 0 to 10. And if you type in 2.99, you're going to do the same, but you're going to have a slider that sets itself in between that. And you can be very specific, double click and say, I want to start at 12.98, and I want that to go to ... that's the keyword for 2, 34.567. And there you go, you get a slider that's very specific into that. You can go even so far as to use the greater than or less than signs to input things that you want things to sit at right in between. So I'm just going to take these from left to right, make sure I encompass all those and get rid of them because I don't want to use them, but that's what I was doing. I'm also using the merge tool, which can be located, Control-Alt, right here in the sets tool over in the tree, and you can bring everything in order. And you'll see I was playing around a little bit here getting into data structure with students, which he didn't, and taking things from making them a list to making them a list of lists. And I'm going to flatten this one so it's not a list of lists, and actually I could just take off the flatten because it defaults those lists. One branch with 6 items, it's visualized as a tree holding all those items at the end of the branch, and this gets more and more complex as you get in and start dealing into Path Mapper, which is a wonderful tool to take data, to double click to null mapping, but it has some standards when you right-click on it, that you can show exactly what's happening in the numbers when you flatten that data. Pretty boring what's happening there, but if I went back to grafting this, and this is when you're analyzing data, and you'll see that I put that to null mapping, and I put that into flatten, that's really what's happening, and you start to control your data. And this is where it got into advanced level, and I'll back off because that's not what he was exploring. But I did want you to get in there and have a look. Customize the panel tool, text panel flow, visual feedback for wires. That's always why I was doing this. Single wires are a single item on a list. A single item on one branch. And then you've got over here, if I took this and did flatten, you'd see these all move to double lines, which is a list on one branch. This gray area is symbolizing one branch. These are the items on that list. And when I go back to that grafting, I'm getting lists of lists, one item on every one, items on the end of each of those branches. What I did want to compare is that this AAB circles are synonymous with working in here. And if I was to go in here and do something like a graph, it's going to introduce the indices and put it into that, and you'll learn how to custom and write within the path mapper to really understand your data. But that is a little bit of extra to what you would be doing. On the 9th video, he does the base geometry and says, listen, let's do things that don't even require a circle and the way we visualize them. Let's take computational arts beyond parametric design that actually is about you seeing the logic as a back-end developer that directs the geometry. You see a geometry that other people don't. And what he does here is he brings in 2 number sliders and shows you how you can customize those through other nodes from the power tool, multiplication, subtraction, and addition, and get those to output different numbers. And as you change, they all change according to that. And then he goes so far as to generate here something which actually ends up being the length of a circle, because he's using pi and filtering it through here and then finding the area of the circle. But he goes so far as to jumble these up, and in the last video he takes something that looks like this, that doesn't help anybody understand anything, and takes the bottom one and shows us how to pull it into beautiful, organized, gorgeous inputs that say they're input sliders. These are the results of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and power, and these are the main operators. So he does the same down here with generating the circle's length and the circle's area. And in the end, we want to write script that's this snazzy, that's this computational as we move to generative and optimization design. I hope you love this video. All credit goes to Jose Luis. Thank you. I taught my class. I'm going to send this out to the students after the fact. If they only knew, I volunteer my time. They just spent nearly 4 hours talking parametric design, an illustrator, and I think a painter for the first time in their life. And I had a blast. I do it free of charge, and hopefully they can use this video to come back, and this will be my first day in once I can teach my elective again next year. Once again, thank you, Jose Luis. You rock. You're amazing. You're the groovy guru. I wish you all the success because you're really helping me in my teaching and moving forward. And also thank you for teaching me Visual Script Studio and allowing me to have an understanding that I can sit and make my own C components, generate my own maths, my own furniture, my own trigonometric jewelry, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.